Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. The Week 3 PTS patch notes are upon us, and in this video, I'll go through the important changes for PvE combat. I thought there were some really great changes in here for the most part, but some others, well, we'll get into that. Really quick before we start, thank you so much to those that have already subscribed to the channel, doing a big giveaway once we hit 50k subs, so if you aren't already and want to help us get there a little quicker, that would be amazing. Subbing on YouTube is free, and you can always change your mind later if you're no longer interested in the content. With that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into it. To start this off, we'll go through some of the combat and gameplay changes. For the Necromancer, Mortal Coil, this morph now restores up to 1020 magicka and stamina over its duration, with its restore happening in increments of 2 seconds, rather than granting 150 health, magicka, and stamina recovery while it's active. And then the developer comment says, much of the feedback for this skill change pointed out a heavy hit to Necromancer tanking and a blandness, as this morph shared the same exact function as Mystic Siphon. Originally, we changed this to aid in the performance of these skills for hybrid builds and server performance, as their original iteration sent a significant amount of messages to the server for how easy they were to keep up. We've opted to go back and allow the restore to be unique and work through block, aid in hybrid functionality, but with more burst-like return rather than gradual, to ensure its performance is still improved. So yeah, looks like they nailed the two big complaints about this one, and should be an okay option to return some resources while blocking still for those necro tanks out there. Pretty clear here that they have been monitoring the feedback. For Nightblade's Refreshing Path fixed an issue where the minor endurance and intellect granted from this morph only applied to the caster rather than all allies. So if you missed it, this skill was buffed to now give minor endurance and intellect. Really awesome utility put into this skill now. This is on the healing morph only, so you can't get it from a DD using the Twisting Path morph, but a really nice boon for group utility for those Nightblade tanks and healers out there. Next up is the Sorcerer. In case you missed this one, Crystal Weapon got a really juicy buff in the week 1 patch notes. Essentially the way it works now is that instead of adding the damage to your next light attack, it adds it to your next 2 light attacks. So you can essentially just cast Crystal Weapon every other ability, and it will double the amount of times that it would normally fire in previous patches. I think it's a really fun and cool new way to interact with a spammable ability. However, it is pretty insanely strong, so they did adjust it some this week, but not the damage from it. So this morph now increases the base cost to $34.43, up from $22.95, to account for the fact that you are capable of getting off 2 casts of the ability for the price of 1. Increase the duration of the skill to 6 seconds, up from 4, to improve accessibility of the skill's charges for heavy attack builds, and this ability can no longer proc on the beginning ticks of channeled heavy attacks to prevent the ability to overload a single attack with tremendous burst. So the developer comment here says, we've seen a lot of positive feedback for this morph where it helps it really stand out as a unique skill to change your rotation and burst windows, but it is currently a little too powerful compared to crystal fragments and other abilities. Rather than reducing the damage of the second charge of the skill, as that could significantly hurt the way we see players are utilizing it on the PTS, we've opted to increase the cost of the ability by 50% to make it feel more like doubling down and planning your rotation by paying a higher upfront cost, but still being cheaper than having to cast the same ability twice, as there are moments when you may not get 2 charges off per cast. We've also built in some protection against channeled heavy attack builds in PvP that could get both charges off in a single heavy attack, which was not very cool to be on the receiving end of. So yeah, I agree. This one definitely needed to be adjusted. I'm not sure for PvE purposes if this is going to make a huge difference in the long run. Sustain will definitely take a hit, but with the new hybrid scaling system in place, there are magicka-based options that you can use to offset that a bit. I think this is probably one they'll continue to keep an eye on because it is really strong, but maybe this limits how easy you can use this really strong tool and makes you compensate for that sustain elsewhere. I feel like in higher end organized groups that are using all of the sustain we have access to and lots of synergies going around to activate, I don't know if this change is going to make a huge difference in those kinds of scenarios. And if nothing else changes, Sorcs are looking to probably be the top DPS for single target damage in the High Isle chapter. Next up is Templar. We have the Living Dark morph of Eclipse. Increase the duration of this morph to 10 seconds, up from 4. Reduce the cost to $40.50, down from $43.20. Developer comment. After adjusting the healing potential, we heard a lot of feedback that the skill's duration and cost no longer justified its output. Rather than going back to insane healing values and bring back the unkillable Godplar we saw rise up, we're going to ensure the skill is easier to keep up in both management of duration and cost, so it feels more like a unique alternative alternative to other healing over time abilities. So the feedback I've heard from PvPers about this is that they kind of nuked this skill. Well, I don't do a lot of PvP nowadays, so I won't comment too much on this one. Maybe this change to 10 seconds will help this out a bit. I'd really like to see some more changes with Templars all around though, specifically Magplar. Stamina Templar got access to all kinds of new goodies with the new hybrid system, and their sustain is really great because a lot of the class skills they want to run are Magicka based. If you do go Magicka Templar though, you still run those same Magicka based class skills, and even with swapping to something like a two-handed backbar, sustain is pretty tough. If you go with the more traditional Magplar setup with a staff backbar, sustain is atrocious. I couldn't even get halfway through a dummy parse without running out of resources, and that was with dropping Ritual of Retribution, which is one of the highest costing Magicka skills, and I was also running Magicka sustain food. So with Ritual slotted, sustain is even worse. Then they just also increased the cost of Purifying Light as well in the week 1 patch. So not that it was a huge increase, but a little bit more to worry about as a Magplar. And though the total damage output is not bad on a Templar, it does seem a bit behind some of the other classes while having to rely on a channeled spammable and a channeled execute to reach their full potential. This is not a big deal on some fights, but really limits them on others, especially when you need to block or roll dodge quite a bit. When you have to interrupt your main abilities just to survive, you miss out on a lot of damage. And while I do think that the channeled spammable and execute they have are plenty strong on their own, I don't think those particular abilities need buffs, but the class as a whole feels a smidge behind where I think would be a good spot for it given those drawbacks. I'd also love to see something done with Sunfire and its morphs as well. These have felt extremely lacking for a long time now, and while many class dots have seen some love over the past couple of years, this one feels like it was just forgotten and left behind. Alright, let's move on to some item set changes. Harpooner's Waiting Kilt increased the duration of the stacks granted from the set to 20 seconds, up from 10, to help it stay up in fights with longer downtime phases, while keeping the shorter duration there to reinforce the need to stay active in the fight. Thank you. This is one I definitely felt like they hit a little too hard with the nerf hammer, especially considering there are many encounters in the game with periods longer than 10 seconds where you don't deal damage and this would drop off. So it's not the full minute it used to be, but 20 seconds definitely seems a bit more fair for keeping this up, especially when we have several new mythic options to work with now that would have already rivaled the Kilt on many encounters. So good change here to bump that back up a little bit and make it a little easier to work with. Next up is one of my favorite changes. This is to the new medium trial set, Coral Riptide. This set now grants its maximum weapon and spell damage when at 33% stamina instead of 0%, and then adjusted the 4-piece bonus to be weapon and spell damage rather than offensive penetration, and then the 5-piece bonus for the perfected version will grant critical chance rather than offensive penetration. So this is one I think the player base gave a lot of feedback on, and wow, they listened and they adjusted. I'm super happy about that. The risk involved with taking your stamina all the way to 0 is much higher than taking your magicka to 0, so they've adjusted the set accordingly where you can now max it out at 33%. I put this little chart together here to show the amount of weapon and spell damage you get at different stamina remaining percentages. So you can see it doesn't take too much before the numbers start to get in a really decent range. And remember, for PvE purposes, this set has Minor Slayer on it as well, which is a really nice 5% damage boost against dungeon and trial enemies. So even just getting your stamina down to like 50 to 60%, you're already starting to get a really nice amount of damage from this. And if you want to go lower, the bonuses will keep rising up to that 740 mark at 33% stamina remaining. You also have to remember that this will be boosted by percent boosts like Major and Minor Brutality and Sorcery, and also other bonuses such as class passives, Fighters Guild passives, and medium armor passives. So this will generally be up over that 1k weapon and spell damage mark after buffs if you are at or below 33% stam remaining. This range is still pretty risky, but you don't have to be super low all the time to still get some good results from this. I think with this update to it, this will feel a little more like Besides Mania now. What I mean is I think that you will still probably get pretty decent results from the set even without getting super sweaty with it, but the sweaty option is there if you want to get the most out of it. If we compare to the original version here, you can see the scaling is in a much better spot overall now. I actually wouldn't mind seeing something similar with Besai as well, not the 33% magicka remaining cap, but maybe have it max out at like 10 to 15% magicka remaining or something along those lines. The way Besai is currently set up is that you can never actually reach that max value that is listed on it, so it's just kind of awkward that it tells you an amount that you can't actually ever hit. I think making Messiah the same 33% threshold is not a good idea due to the difference in risk involved, but I do like the idea of it maxing before you're completely out of juice. And then finally, the last thing I'll comment on is that they changed the penetration lines as well. This is really great to line up with the current state of the game for PvE purposes. Since we can either go the route of having Alkosh in the group, or we can run the new penetration champion point node, these penetration lines were pretty underwhelming. Felt like bonuses that would have been very welcome in previous patches, but not so much in this patch. I will say the pin lines could have been nice for PvP, and especially now with the scaling changes, this could actually be a fairly decent PvP set. So the pin lines might have been better there, but end of the day, it is a trial set, so I would rather it be more geared towards group PvE content, but it does seem like it could be decent outside of that as well. All right, next up we have the Oaken Soul Ring. Please don't yell at me on this one for saying it needed to be nerfed. I said it needed to be slightly adjusted, not nuked into oblivion. But let's run through the changes and I'll give some feedback on a few different routes that I think they can go with this to get it back to a really appealing option for 1-bar setups without being in an overpowered state like it was initially for weeks 1 and 2. So they said this set now grants many major buffs rather than unique stats to ensure its power does not eclipse builds that are already utilizing both bars effectively, while also reducing some of its raw power with werewolf builds which already contain many of these major buffs, as the werewolf experience is already designed around having 1 bar. This set now grants major courage rather than 450 unique weapon and spell damage. This set now grants major savagery and prophecy rather than a unique 1973 critical chance rating. This set now grants major endurance, fortitude, and intellect rather than unique health, magicka, and stamina recovery. And this set now grants major resolve rather than a unique 5280 armor. Oof, oof, and more oof. So let's read the developer comment. Oaken Soul is a mythic that we knew would come under close scrutiny due to the sheer amount of power it can provide, even with the downside of only being able to utilize 1 ability bar. Most of the discussion we've seen so far has been about the potential power spike with werewolf transformation, as the downside with Oaken Soul is irrelevant in this case, as well as how close many 1-bar builds are to 2-bar builds, and in some cases doing better with only 1 bar. With consideration for the original theme of the mythic, we decided to move the power from several of the derived bonuses into major buffs. This change will cause the base strength of the mythic to remain nearly the same while lowering the ceiling on certain builds and playstyles. So while I understand what they're saying, I do kind of disagree with that last statement. These major buffs they introduced are super easy to get, even solo. For the savagery and prophecy, you can either use potions that provide these, or you can just slot inner light or camo hunter. Both of these skills have really nice passives that go along with them, making them very popular options to get these buffs. For the recovery bonuses, those are the same exact bonuses that you are getting from your potions, so unless you're just not running potions that have resource return on them, which is pretty rare I'd say, you're essentially getting nothing from these bonuses as well. And then that major resolve buff, it's something every class has access to, again, usually with a skill that gives a lot of other nice perks as well. While you could argue that on a 1-bar build, this would be tough to fit on that bar. That is true, but if you have a warden in your group, then everyone gets this anyways from Frostcloak, and you have another wasted bonus. And even without a warden group, the skills with this buff on them usually have a pretty long timer and are not too difficult to keep up. And then finally, the major courage buff. Yes, this is not a common one to be able to achieve solo, but it is one of the most common buffs you get from supports in group play. And if you are solo, you could just use the other new mythic that they introduced, the Sea Serpent's Coil, and get this buff along with Major Berserk, and you still get to use your back bar. So for group play, man, this is really bad now. I didn't feel like this was originally being marketed as the solo mythic. The Pale Order ring already kind of has that role locked down. To me, this felt more like an accessibility mythic for those that are looking for a bit easier time keeping up with the pack without having the strain of constant bar swapping. And I really liked the idea of that, but I feel like that concept should include group play as well. So as it is now, the majority of the bonuses on this thing are just redundant. You'd be just as well off using something else and only playing on your 1 bar. For solo, it is is a little more appealing than for group play, but even then, as I already pointed out, there are very easy ways to get these bonuses into your build. I could run the Sea Serpent's Coil Mythic for that Major Courage and get a bonus Major Berserk along with it, potions for my Major Resource Return buffs, Inner Lighter Camo Hunter for my Savagery and Prophecy, and then if we didn't want to put a armor skill on our front bar, we could just use our back bar just for one skill, just for an armor buff, and it'd be super easy to keep up without a lot of strain, and we're pretty much in the same spot we are here. Or like in the case of a Sorcerer, their ability that gives this buff, Hurricane, is a really strong damage ability too, so they would be more than able to front bar it. Overall, this mythic just doesn't make a lot of sense to me in its new form. It doesn't really add anything meaningful that isn't already super easy to get. I do understand the intent, but I think it just missed the mark a bit. So how can it be better? Well, first off, they could have just lowered the values some. The amounts for everything that they put on the initial version were all super jacked. Yeah, it's no wonder it was overpowered. It had insane amounts of all of the stats. Not only were you really tanky, but you still kept most of your damage from losing that back bar. Well, now with this new version, you don't really have either, so they could have just lowered the values on these some, maybe by 33% or so. I don't know, maybe even more than that. But then if that was too strong on a werewolf, you can just add in a werewolf stipulation that cuts those new values in half again. I think that would be much more appealing than having a bunch of redundant major buffs that are extremely easy to get. It wasn't way overpowered in most scenarios, it just needed to be tweaked. So that is one option that I think would be received a little bit better than its current form. And then if the devs are dead set on making this mythic just a bunch of named buffs, I think it could work all right. So another option would be to simply add more of them to it. It still wouldn't be overpowered or make people feel like they need to go with a one bar setup, since these would be redundant and optimized group play, but could definitely help in some less organized group play or solo play. Major Brutality and Sorcery are at the top of this list. I definitely feel like they fit in for sure with going that ease of access route. I'm kind of surprised they weren't on there with Prophecy and Savagery being on there. And then we have a bunch of other major buffs. I'd say they could probably add 2 more of these to the mythic, and we have a bunch of minor buffs to choose from as well. So while I don't like this route as much as just lowering the original values, I think if they do want to go the named buff route, they need to make it a little more enticing, since there is that drawback of 1 bar only. Otherwise, if I wanted to do a 1 bar setup, I'd probably just choose a different mythic and limit most of my gameplay to 1 bar. So I do hope this gets more adjustments as the PTS goes on. I thought it was a little too strong in its original form, but was hoping they could have gone a bit different route when taking care of that. As it is now, it feels very unexciting, and I'm sure a lot of the players that were originally really looking forward to this are now feeling kind of disappointed. Let me know in the comments what you guys think about the current iteration of Oakensoul. Alright, moving on, they also adjusted the Shapeshifter's Chain Mythic. This one not only reduces your ult cost to transform, but now gives a 15% cost reduction to your abilities as well. So with this one having lower stats than something like Death Dealer's Fate, it wasn't really too appealing for a werewolf setup, since once you are transformed, you're typically trying to stay in that form. Not sure if this does the trick or not, but a buff for those going that route for sure. They also made a lot of changes to the new Dreadsail Reef trial. I won't go through all of those. If you haven't been in there, it's probably just going to be a bunch of gibberish. I've been doing it some on the PTS, doing the veteran modes, and pretty fun. They are opening up the hard modes as well this week, so they were closed for weeks 1 and 2, but the hard modes are now open for week 3 on. They said the Undaunted challenge banners are now available to use while on the PTS, and to aid in testing, there's no requirement to defeat a boss in hard mode to be eligible to face the next boss in hard mode. This requirement will be reinstated after PTS completes. So get in there and check those out. I'm sure some other in-game raiders will be streaming these on Twitch as well. I'll try to stream at least a run or 2 if any of my groups run the hard modes. That's going to do it for this video. I'll have another video out this week covering the new champion point changes as well, and we'll make sure to keep you all up to date with all of the important info throughout this PTS cycle. I want to give a big thanks to my current Patreon supporters and YouTube members. There are ways to help support this channel and keep the guides coming for as little as $3. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougar's Bay in the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Iffy, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Blakewin816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Nalandia, and my wonderful wife. Thanks again for stopping by. I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye. Hey, that was pretty smooth.
Ja, das ist so